Funding for this program has been made possible by the Idaho Public Television Endowment, by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and viewers like you. Thank you. Welcome to the University of Idaho's McClure Center for Public Policy Research, Forum on Science and the Sage-Grouse.
Good evening and welcome to the Lincoln Auditorium here at the Idaho State Capitol. I'm Aaron Coons. I'll be moderating the McClure Center Forum on Science and the Sage-Grouse, giving you a deeper understanding of the state's role in managing sage-grouse and its habitat. We want to give special thanks tonight to the University of Idaho for supporting these types of discussions that give the citizenry the information they need to be engaged. But before we get started, let's give you some background on sage-grouse, and for that, we turn to Chris Milgate.
Just as the light of day drenches the desert, the dance begins.
Beautiful. It's all beauty.
Ron Laird has a front row seat every morning. He manages the Nature Conservancy Ranch near Dubois. It's one of the largest sage-grouse mating areas in Idaho.
Well, the sole purpose of the ranch is to enhance wildlife habitat, but primarily sage-grouse.
The powerful popping noise of swelling chests is meant to entice the ladies.
The birds are in their strutting phase right now. We're trying to impress the females.
The sage-grouse strut is a dazzling sight, but it's a show that is getting harder and harder to see. The birds that know it best are dwindling in numbers across the West. Sage-grouse are still found in 11 states, but they're not found in vast numbers of old. Grouse gather at leks. Lek route research goes back to the 50s in eastern Idaho. In 1959, the average number of males on a lek was 60. In 1979, it dropped to 45. In 1999, 18. And in 2009, 15. Sage-grouse hunting dwindled with the birds. In many places, there is no hunt at all. In other areas, it went from a 3-bird bag limit to 1.
You know, I see very few hunters out actually. The price of gas, you can't hardly afford to drive out for one bird.
The drastic decline in birds could be because of this, sagebrush. Sage-grouse need sagebrush year-round, from mating and nesting to food and cover.
It's pretty simple. Sage-grouse needs sagebrush. If the sagebrush goes away, there won't be any sage-grouse.
Wildfire burned brush to the stump west of Rexburg in 2003. A lightning-caused fire wiping out 12,000 acres. Aerial seeding dropped grasses and sage a few months after the burn. Now, more than a decade later, wildlife is starting over. But the sagebrush stands only a foot high.
Desert fires burn rapidly, quickly, and consume a lot of fuel, and then it takes a very long time for the vegetation to come back. You're looking at 25 to 75 years before it kind of goes back to its pre-fire existence.
Wildfires that used to spark every 25 years now light up every 2 to 5 years. Not nearly enough time for sagebrush to recover. It is the shrinking canopy of the West.
Wildland fire is our number one threat at this point to sage-grouse because it wipes out so much territory.
If the threat continues to beat back the brush, sage-grouse could be on the endangered species list by 2015.
So kind of one of the first things that we looked at.
The governor's sage-grouse task force is set up to avoid that. The committee sent recovery recommendations to the federal government, which includes the Bureau of Land Management. The BLM manages 63% of the sage-grouse habitat in Idaho. It too wants to avoid a listing.
If the bird is listed, it will not be business as usual on public lands, and we will see changes in our ability for ATV use, for grazing, for mineral leasing, for infrastructure placement.
The frustration lies here, in a fast-burning, slow-growing plant that this show-stopping bird can't live without.
All right, and that was Chris Milgate producing tonight's video. Thank you so much for that. And let's go ahead and introduce you to tonight's panel. We have Donna Bennett, co-chair of the Owyhee County Sage-Grouse Local Working Group. We also have Brett Dumas. He's on the Governor's Sage-Grouse Task Force as a member and the environmental supervisor at Idaho Power. John Robison, Governor's Sage-Grouse Task Force member and public lands director at the Idaho Conservation League. We also have here on stage Jack Conley with Idaho Fish and Game, a biologist there, and the co-editor of the textbook on sage-grouse called The Greater Sage-Grouse: Ecology and Conservation of a Landscape Species and Its Habitats. Also, we have Brenda Richards, the Owyhee County Treasurer and the Vice President of the Public Lands Council, a national organization representing ranchers who use public lands. And we have Senator Burt Brackett, also serving on the Governor's Sage-Grouse Task Force as a member and senator from District 23 in southwest Idaho. Thank you all for being here, and some of you really traveled out of your way to be here tonight. Thank you so much. Let's get right to it, and I guess I'm going to direct my first question to Jack Conley. And you know, we hear a lot about science, and before I get to what I intended to ask, why is science important in the process of when we talk about environmental protection?
That's a great question. Science is important, at least in my view, because it gives us a firm foundation for any actions we may want to take down the road. We're rather than basing our judgment on speculation, guesswork, wishful thinking, we can fall back on facts, or at least something as close to a fact as we can possibly get.
And let's get to it. You know, reading some of the studies that have been done, sometimes they can be a bit on the dry side. And I'm not casting judgment here, but how do you make it so that it's understandable and usable to the local stakeholders and the lawmakers who are driving policy?
Well, again, it's tough because scientists like to talk to one another. And we don't do a great job of talking to the public or to our policymakers. I think we don't move into that comfort zone very readily. And so we may have some great discussions among our scientists, but we shy away from everyone else. And so to make the science relevant, I believe that we have to, as scientists, do a better job of communicating. For sage-grouse, as an example, the first thing we need to do is to be able to clearly communicate what the problem is. Once we do that, once people understand what the problem is, then the next step, I believe, for a scientist is to provide some reasonable alternatives or solutions, okay? We kind of fall down on that too. We like to talk about what the problems are, but we often don't want to take it that next step and provide the management solution. And we need to do that. And then the third thing that again, falling under the heading of communication, we also, I think, have an obligation to make sure people understand what science is and what it's not.
Being useful for the policymakers. Senator, you've been key in this. Have they been effective in giving you the science so that you can make an informed decision when it comes to writing policy?
Aaron, I must disclose, in addition to my job as a senator, I'm a lifelong rancher. And so I've lived and worked with sage-grouse and cows my entire life. As far as the science, facts are our friends, but we need the facts. And, you know, one of the things that I've really appreciated about Jack Conley, and I'll never forget, probably the most important thing is when a question comes up, he says, "Show me the data." In other words, you know, what's it grounded in? And failure to have the data, failure to have the facts, then personal opinion and personal biases can creep in.
Is it pretty accurate to say, though, that as a rancher, as someone who talks to the folks locally, not everyone agrees with the science? Is that a factual statement?
Aaron, that absolutely it is. There are strongly held opinions, both in and outside the industry, and that's very understandable.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's bring in John Robison. Actually, when we talk about sometimes this disconnect between the science community and those who are actually living on the land, they've been working on it. In fact, a lot of times when you talk to the ranchers and the farmers, they say that they are the true environmentalists. They were there first. They have a stake in making sure the land remains fruitful. I've seen some change over the years on how the Idaho Conservation League has been dealing with these types of issues and bringing stakeholders to the table. You guys go out and talk to the community face-to-face in public meetings. What was the basis for that change, and why is that important?
Sure. And one of the things is when the Idaho Conservation League is working on wildlife issues and trying to protect our wildlife heritage, we have a couple options. One, sometimes we use litigation to enforce laws designed to protect wildlife. Other times we use collaboration. And so depending on the issue, we figure out which approach is actually most likely to end up with the greatest, longest lasting conservation benefit for Idaho's wildlife. In this case, with the Sage-Grouse Task Force, initially we were somewhat skeptical about how things would go, and I'm really pleased to say that I'm cautiously optimistic and that we really have a strong foundation here. What was really successful with this program was bringing folks, the ranchers and farmers and folks and sportsmen, conservationists together who all had their own piece of the puzzle and all had their own perspectives and their observations, their anecdotes. And those are been built over for years and generations. And what we found is we were able to fact check these and say, okay, well, I've noticed this happening, whether it's the impacts of fences, or is it predation, or is it what? And we were able to bring those issues to the specialists, to the researchers who have been working on a statewide level or even a regional level and say, well, I'm seeing some symptoms out there. And is this actually a major threat, or is this a symptom of an underlying issue? And what we found was we were able quickly to say, okay, these are side issues or distractions. And some of these core issues, namely wildfires and invasive species, habitat fragmentation, these are real issues that affect not just the sage-grouse, but also the livelihood of the ranchers, the farmers. It creates a lot of uncertainty for the communities out here. And so through this process, by bringing everyone together, we said, we actually have a lot more common ground than we thought we did. And we were able to focus, because of science, and actually the Fish and Game and others provided tremendous expertise to say, don't follow this shoddy object over here, actually stay on track and let's deal with these major issues. And I think the task force really put a really strong foundation together to deal with that on the federal land component.
What was the turning point for those who you're talking to who may have been a little bit cold on the science, and how did you explain that? Because oftentimes you're the spokesperson for taking the science and explaining it to the local levels. Mm-hmm.
I think getting out on the ground is key, and building on personal observation, saying, yes, that is an issue, but what is the underlying issue in this case? So what we found is that everyone really understands at a fundamental level the threat that wildfires pose and the threat that invasive species pose. And we said, okay, I believe the science on that's clear. I see it. I've seen it firsthand. And then in terms of some of the other issues that we're unclear of, like, well, I'm not sure about that, and I might debate you on that one, and I have a different opinion on that. As a task force, we were able to say, okay, we don't know. Let's actually put that aside, go with what we do know, where there is common agreement. And for these other issues, you said, you know what, that's a good study question, and let's see what science comes back to us with that, and it'll inform our process as we go. But we built our recommendations on what we agreed upon and what the science affirmed.
Do you think, Senator, that this process would hold up under federal scrutiny if we didn't have science involved in it?
It's based on best available science. It might not be very good science, it might be questionable, but if that's the best available, that's what's used.
People may not realize is that we do have an advantage with sage-grouse. We collectively, as a scientific community, have been studying sage-grouse since the 1930s. Idaho pioneered some of the very early and critical sage-grouse research done in the 1950s and 60s. So we're not new to this game, and we do know an awful lot about sage-grouse. More about sage-grouse than most other wildlife species in the state.
What's important, if we were to just take science off the table for the moment, what's important for the ranching community, for them to feel happy at the end of the day?
Actually, what's important for the ranching community isn't much different than what's important for healthy sage-grouse habitat, and that is the easiest way to put it out there. We provide water for wildlife, different things like that, and we're very happy to do it. And I think through these conversations, we've learned a lot about what our alfalfa fields and meadows provide to the sage-grouse habitat, what managed grazing components do out there to keep healthy sagebrush habitat. And I think there's a balance out there, and in the end, I think what's going to keep the rural communities healthy and vibrant and unfragmented, which with a fragmented habitat, you're not going to have any type of wildlife that's going to thrive. It's a pretty easy answer because that is also going to be sustainable for the sage-grouse.
Donna, let me bring you into this discussion, and do you agree with that? What needs to be included in a state-led discussion and ultimate management plan?
I'm a rancher too. My family was in the ranching industry since the early 1900s. So, and sage-grouse have always been an ultimate part of that ranching community. What's good for the ranchers is good for the birds. What's good for the ranchers is good for the economy. What the science needs to do is listen to the ranchers and the people that are out in the field day by day, because they know what's going on with the birds that somebody that goes out there and studies them for maybe a day or 2 days or 3 days, they don't really know what they actually do and where they go and what they prefer.
Brett, let's bring you into this conversation now. And Idaho Power is instrumental also in this process. Idaho Power has been doing its own science on all of this. Why is this important for the utility?
Well, you got to keep in mind that Idaho Power service territory overlaps with sage-grouse habitat in Idaho. Our customers are in sage-grouse habitat. Our future activities are in sage-grouse habitat. So and I've been working on sage-grouse issues for quite some time. We had the fortune of coming into this project having just gone through the routing process of Gateway West.
Yeah.
And we learned a lot through that. We got to engage in a lot of our communities and deal with a lot of issues. So, we sat down and I was familiar with what the federal government would be proposing, and I knew that the one-size-fit-all was going to really constrain our ability to adequately meet our customers' needs. So we looked at how do we protect our customers' interest. The rancher that wants to put a power line out to their irrigation pump, we're mandated to do that. How do we do that in a way that doesn't overly impact our customer because of something we might agree to through a process like this? We're also interested in where can we balance. We're in a unique position that we're an Idaho company, but we don't have to continually look to grow and take up more resources. What we need to do is make sure we're providing the power that our communities need. And we have flexibility in how we do that. So we came into this with a balanced perspective of these are the things we need, and these are the things that we have flexibility with. And I think going through this process, and what was required there was to have flexibility in the plan. And from our perspective, the one-size-fit-all plan didn't have that flexibility. It was going to be too burdensome given the benefits that it would bring. And so we were committed to working through the governor's Sage-Grouse Advisory Group to achieve something that would both protect the bird and we could continue meeting our customers' needs.
Would we be talking about sage-grouse today if the federal government didn't say we may take action in September 2015, even though we've seen a decline in the populations of sage-grouse?
We were having these conversations 30 years ago. I think, and again, Bert, correct me if I'm wrong, but sage-grouse seem to have a special place in the heart of a lot of our stakeholders, our ranchers, and when populations start to decline, people get concerned and they want to know why. It's only been recently that we've had, sort of the perfect storm of environmental conditions and so forth that have really driven populations down, but 20 and 30 years ago, we were talking to ranchers about sage-grouse, and they were expressing concerns to us and asking questions. So I think we would still be having the conversation, maybe not quite as intense right now, and we wouldn't have the worry lines that some of us have, but we would still have the conversation. We would still be trying to move forward to do the right thing.
Would it have as much support if it wasn't so well known? Because I think a lot of the voting public are in large metropolitan areas of the state. They don't live where sage-grouse are in their backyards. So would it have the support from lawmakers from all four corners of the state?
It would have a lot of support. Hunting is an annual tradition in the fall, and we're to the point that many sportsmen can remember when they used to hunt, and it's very limited now, so they miss that.
Actually, let me dovetail that question from hunting, Jack, to a question to you specifically about hunting. There is a hunting season for sage-grouse, so a lot of people question why there's a hunting season when sage-grouse populations are on the decline.
We can take the next hour and a half talking about this subject. Let me try to make a couple of brief points. Certainly there's a concern, the almost people that question the logic of having a hunting season for a species that seems to be in trouble. But Idaho, as well as other western states, as I've already said, spend a considerable amount of time and effort monitoring these populations. We collect data during the spring that allows us to monitor population trends over space and time. We collect data from wings from grouse that have been shot by hunters, and those hunters are actually out there acting like little sampling tools for us, and that gives us information on actual production. So yeah, we have a hunting season, and Senator Brackett is correct. It's very short. You know, it's 1 week, 1 bird a day. And so we have really reduced that, but there are some benefits to having it. First, we get the data. Second, we have an engaged constituency. Hunters are involved, and they want to participate. And so now let me tell you just a short story about a sage-grouse hunter. All of us have been following the sage-grouse issue, have come to know over the last few years that in some cases, some places, barbed wire fences have a real significant impact on sage-grouse. They fly into them and they die. We began with the University of Idaho a collaborative study a few years ago that was able to characterize the magnitude of that problem and then develop a management answer that would reduce those collisions by over 80%. And that's all great stuff. But that problem was not identified by a hunter, well, by a biologist. It was identified by a sage-grouse hunter who was actually out near Dubois, Idaho, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, and found a sage-grouse lying by a fence. And it looked to him like the grouse flew into the fence. And he got wondering whether or not that was something that commonly occurred. He hunts with a shotgun and a bird dog, and he also flies a falcon, so he's out a lot. So he called me. And the next day we took a little drive. We drove 2 miles along a couple of fences. And in that 2 miles we counted 26 collisions. All of a sudden, an observation turned into an issue, which then turned into a research project, which we then were able to turn into a management solution. All driven by science, but started by a single interested bird hunter. So that's why one of the reasons we have hunting season.
John, I really want to get your perspective and pick your brain on this. What are your feelings on a hunting season?
Well, this is where it was actually really, really helpful to have the finding from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service identifying the main threats. And even the Idaho State Sage-Grouse Advisory Committee had ranked the threats. And hunting and issues like predation from ravens were 12 and 17 on the list. And so we could spend all our time marshaling the governor's office, the legislature, all private property, Forest Service, BLM, everything on those issues, and still end up with a listed species and that's declining and impaired with extinction. And so that would be a distraction. And so instead we say, actually, that's a small little thing, small change. The main issue, though, are wildfire, invasive species, and also just habitat fragmentation from inappropriate development. And we said that's actually where we need to focus. And that was guided by the science and also guided by the review from Fish and Wildlife Service saying, hey, here's a big thing. The other big issue is, of course, the lack of adequate regulatory mechanisms preventing degradation of habitat. And so we also needed to have a commitment, some resolve, some skin in the game, saying, actually, we're going to put ourselves to task here and make sure we conserve and restore this habitat. Now that has been partially accomplished here with the task force and the governor's recommendation and the plan that's for federal land. We have a lot of work to do on the state and private as well to complement that. But I think the science really helped direct our focus, because otherwise we could be chasing basically wild goose chase there, so to speak.
And if I could further clarify, Idaho Department of Fish and Game has closed some areas to sage-grouse hunting. We have had some areas closed for many, many years with no resulting increase. The state of Washington closed sage-grouse hunting in 1986. Again, no apparent effect on the population. So I think the science is pretty clear there that it may be in some very small areas we want to be careful about hunting, but it's not a big ticket item at this point in terms of the conservation of the species, and it does provide some benefit.
Brenda, Donna, do you have anything to add to this? Or a hunting season, good, bad?
I don't think it's bad, as long as they don't extend it. They closed it in Owyhee County several years ago because of the West Nile. That was decimating the birds. And so they closed it that year, and the next year I think the population was coming back. It's been gradually coming back up since, even with the hunting. We have hunters come into our place that hunt the birds, and I don't, a lot of times they don't get anything either. So the only time that it maybe affect the population at all are drought years like this year, because the sage-grouse come into the water holes, and the guys that are astute enough to know which water holes the birds come to, then they just stay around there and can shoot them. But other than that, it's not a bad thing.
Erin, I would tend to concur with that, but I'd also go back to the fact that we use it as a communication tool, again, for education on why there might be a difference or why the Fish and Game has to look at this a little bit differently. And I would concur with what Jack says. They're always, because of the interest in this bird, looking at the data, looking at what comes in every year from those wing barrels. And so it's a moving target, no pun intended, but anyway, it just, it's something that they keep looking at. And as long as that communication is open, I think it's a win-win for everybody.
Do you have an example where you don't necessarily agree with the process?
I can't say that I have any example of not agreeing with the process. I think John indicated right off the get-go, when you bring such a passion, and everybody you've got has a love for Idaho, a love for the lands, whether it's private lands, state lands, or federal, we have to meld them in Idaho. So the passion comes to the table, and there may be some really vibrant discussions. But when you recognize what you're looking for and can agree in the end on some things, on even that wildfire, invasives, fragmented habitat, that those are the things we're going to focus on. The other ones right now are a distraction. That keeps you moving in the right direction. So whether or not you agree on some of those other things, like whether it's predators or even the fence study, for a long time before the data came in, everybody, kind of was speculative on it. You can disagree on it, but you still have to have the open communication and be willing to leave some things over in the distraction level and move forward for the good of the whole.
Yeah, giving that some thought real quick, Brenda, you were there for the creation of the Owyhee Initiative. Mm-hmm. This is a ultimate plan that not everyone necessarily agreed with, but in the end, everyone kind of felt that if we gave a little bit, they wouldn't lose more in the end if they weren't involved, if they didn't take part in the process. What are the similarities between that and this, and is that how this is shaping up to be?
You know, I see a lot of similarities. Again, the roadless project or plan is another thing. Idaho's very unique in the resilience and the ability of people to come together when there's an opportunity and work on some of these things. We're such a diverse state, and again, it's not just in the topography. Our county over there is 78% federal land. We have state lands intermixed. Then we've got really, really strong rural communities, which lends to that unfragmented habitat that is so desired, you know, for wildlife, for the communities, for all of it, for the economic basis of the county. The process, you have to be willing to come into it with an open mind, and you have to be willing to listen. And you're not always going to go away every single day at the meeting feeling really good, like you got everything you needed, but it gives you something to think about and something to bring back to the table. So I think the initiative, the task force, these things have a lot in common of a desire to protect some key components that we have and some really good things we have in Idaho. When you bring it down to a local level, site-specific science, I think we've learned that too, that you can't blanket it with science from Arizona or New Mexico. Idaho's unique, and when you bring in the people that live there, and then you bring in the scientists and the policymakers, and you bring them all together, and economic aspect, I think that there's a lot to be gained from all of it.
Senator, in fact, we see a lot of this with federal issues where it's almost a one-size-fits-all decision. In this case, we're trying to say one size does not fit all. Idaho is not any other state out there. How important is having a state-led process?
Well, it's terribly important. You know, and absolutely right, one size does not fit all. And the state Sage-Grouse plan is really a good example of that. It's unique to Idaho. It you know, takes into consideration the you know, the individual characteristics and the uniquenesses of different parts of the state, and brings the passion of all the different user groups and interest groups together to formulate a policy. And I think it's very significant, as Dustin Miller pointed out. Idaho is the only state that their plan is being analyzed, in this case, as a co-preferred in the EIS. So we feel good about that. In
fact, for those who think it's just a bird and a couple of acres of land, we're talking millions of dollars when you're running a power line like Gateway West.
That's correct. We are working on the Sage-Grouse mitigation plan for Gateway West right now, and there's a lot of money involved in it. So
I can only imagine.
There'll be lots of opportunities for projects probably in the future to benefit Sage-Grouse. And Gateway West did an incredibly good job of routing in such a way to try and avoid impacts to Sage-Grouse. But when you're routing something like that, you got to keep in mind that it's not just about Sage-Grouse. You know, there's 50 different issues out there that are the issue to somebody, whether it's farm ground or, you know, whatever it is, scenic values, the Oregon Trail. And so we're in a position where we've got to find balance amongst a lot of competing interests. Sage-Grouse happens to be heightened right now, but for other people, it's some other issue. And so, you know, we've had to face that of how to find a balance amongst all these competing interests.
Idaho Power actually has its hand in some of the science developed. What have you learned? Is there anything unique that you could share with us?
Well, you know, power lines are one of the issues that have been suggested as an impact in creating fragmentation, that the birds don't like tall structures. You know, so we have been doing a lot of work to try and figure out how do our power lines relate to where sage-grouse are doing well and where they're not doing well. And it's as Jack knows, it's a very difficult issue to try and tease out really what is the problem. It takes intensive empirical studies that are difficult to do. But when you look at the trends, Yeah, there's a lot of areas where we don't have sage-grouse and there's power lines. Well, where we have power lines, there's a lot of people. And where we have power lines, there's a lot of agriculture and there's a lot of other things. So it's very difficult to tease out what is the singular role of a power line versus all the other issues together. But that's something that we're still working on, trying to figure out. As an industry, we've just developed a whole document of best management practices. How can we design lines? How can we site lines? How can we operate to try and protect and minimize the impacts that we have?
You say that there's still a lot of work to be done. We heard the same thing from you, Jack. That brings me to this question about grazing and whether it's good or bad. There's been some argument that by grazing it reduces the amount of burnable fuel that's out there, and so it's good. But at the same time, does it destroy sage-grouse habitat? Where are we on that?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one.
I'm in the power business.
You know, good grazing, bad grazing is bad for grouse, and good grazing either beneficial or it's not an issue. I think it's interesting to note that the primary threats are wildfire and invasives and fragmentation. Grazing is a secondary threat, but I can safely say that an inordinate amount of time has been spent and attention on grazing, and you know, that's just the world we live in. One of the things, and maybe this is where the science isn't fully complete yet, as unintended consequence. And so if you eliminate or cut back grazing, that does increase the fire risk. We can show fence line contrasts where it burned up to the fence on an ungrazed pasture, stopped on the grazed pasture. But again, that's called anecdotal evidence, even though it's in a photo. But there has been some work done on that. You know, originally it wasn't considered. You know, it was all anecdotal, but it was such common sense. But you go to the literature, and there was nothing that really substantiated that. Well, more recently, there has been some research projects that have demonstrated that you reduce the fuel load, and it doesn't eliminate fires or prevent fires, but it helps on their intensity.
A listing would really have a big impact, I imagine, on ranching, particularly Brenda. What does this mean for you as a rancher?
Well, Aaron, there's several components to this because, yes, my business occupation may be a rancher, but we're also part of small rural communities, which, as everyone's indicated here, you know, from John to the power, you know, to Idaho Power, all of that, is part of the unfragmented habitat. I go a little bit further with what Senator Brackett says. Grazing of the 30s and 40s isn't the grazing that we have today. It's totally different, and managed grazing practices are a healthy resource. And so I think we're finding that, and I think those are some of the opportunities for projects, because ironically, some of the years when the birds were the highest is when the resource was in the worst condition. There's really no foundation for why that is. It just happens to be some of that information that's out there. So there's a lot we need to look at. So in order to preserve those rural communities and keep that landscape out there, it's got to be partnerships, which again, we're really looking forward to some of these scientific projects. The university's been looking at things. The Bureau of Land Management has been looking at some things. And part of it is because of this communication and the willingness for diverse groups to sit down and say, okay, we may not have sound science on this. We have some ideas, but do we have proof in the pudding? And I think I would like to hear maybe from Jack on that, because I think there's been a lot. Grazing is one of the most tangible things to change, as Senator Brackett said. It doesn't mean that it's going to fix it. It's just when you let fear or supposition drive a decision sometimes. It may not be that that's the solution. So I think we need to be very careful. There's a reason why the habitat is good, and our core habitat, which this task force has identified, is in the condition it's in. And I think we need to make sure we don't make any radical changes to that that may upset the balance. I'm not a scientist. I just know what I need next year to keep that resource, and that it's a delicate balance. It's just like your yard. You know, some years it's a little bit different. You have to adjust water, you have to adjust weed management, all of that. The range is no different, it's just a little bit bigger backyard, so it's a constantly moving aspect.
Are you okay with reducing the amount of grazing? Because in Idaho we have so much, well over 60% that's federally owned and managed land, some of that BLM, and a lot of that is grazing land. Does this worry you as a rancher, Donna?
Yes. The ranchers, if you don't take care of the land that you graze on, your cows aren't going to do well. You're not going to be able to go back and get the use out of it that you can. Sage-grouse don't just take a couple of acres, they take miles, because where they lek and where they nest and where they brood rear can sometimes be 20 or 30 miles. So, you know, they've got different stages in their growth. And we have a rancher that is a neighbor who holistic grazes, which means he moves his cattle every 2 or 3 days. And because of that, he's out there with the sage-grouse, or with the cattle and the sage-grouse, and he watches those sage-grouse all the time. And he says that in the brood rearing part, when the cows move, the sage-grouse follow the cows, because the babies, the chicks, need the protein that's in the bugs, that's in the manure. And so they follow the cows to get the manure and get the bugs. So it's symbiotic, it works together.
Let me elaborate just a little more on some of these comments. So grazing is a hot button issue. We all know that. There's been a lot of litigation over grazing and sage-grouse habitat. It'll probably continue for a while. Don't you agree? One of the problems we have is we simply don't, as everybody has already pointed out, we don't have hard data here. We don't have definitive answers. We have speculation, we have anecdotal observations, we have our opinions, right? And we certainly know that in the 1950s and 60s, we had more sage-grouse than we have now. And we had more cows and more issues with grazing, okay? But we also have a lot more fire now than we did then, a lot more invasive species and so forth. So one of the things that's going on, Aaron, that I'm really excited about is we have a collaborative research project developing now that is focusing on the interaction between livestock grazing and sage-grouse. That brings in the Rangeland Resource Center from the University of Idaho, the Cooperative Wildlife Research Unit at the University of Idaho, Idaho Department of Fish and Game, BLM, Idaho Conservation League. Think of it almost as a mini research task force that's addressing this issue. Not because it is the major driver, but because it is so controversial, it's taking up a lot of resources and maybe causing us to go down some rabbit trails that we really don't need to go down. So stay tuned. In a few years, I suspect we will have some of the data that are currently lacking.
How long does it take to develop this science? Because it seems to me like you go 5 years, but then, at year 10 you learn something new. At year 20 you learn something new. Science is never ending.
We live in a constantly changing environment. All of us do. So we never have the perfect answer. The best we can do is manage our uncertainty and make sure that the information I might provide to, say, Senator Brackett or Idaho Power is described in a manner that lets them understand whatever variation there might be going on, whatever uncertainty there is. And then they can make their own decision as to, yeah, that's a really great answer and there's very little uncertainty associated, we're going with it, or not. Yeah.
And I think that's one of the benefits of the task force is we said, okay, well, what's the science say on this? Does this make sense to everyone? And we had a great job with Fish and Game, Fish and Wildlife Service saying, here's the data. We said, okay, are we addressing that? And then there's some unknowns, like, I don't know, and I've got strongly held opinions on this, but we'll see. And that's why we said, let's build a plan that's flexible enough to incorporate that information as it comes in and we'll adjust. So the plan, and it's not just based on anecdotal evidence. I mean, these are national lands we're talking about here across most of sage-grouse habitat. So it is important to have a national perspective on these, informed but not dictated by local experience. And the science has been a great equalizer in all of this. And we said, okay, that's a good question mark. Let's go and do a project on that. And then we have the ability to amend, adapt our sage-grouse plan according to that new information as it comes available.
I would like to add, and this has to do with infrastructure and power lines. One of the things that was discussed at length and came out of the task force, and it's been pursued then through the Hawaii County working group, is rather than putting a new power line for Gateway West right down through the middle of Hawaii County, co-locate through the birds of prey. There's an existing power line that goes through the birds of prey, and it's been determined feasible to co-locate the new line with the old line and minimal additional impact.
We're very quickly running out of time, but Jack, let me just say that we have 20 PhD students here in the audience with us. These are the careers that they are pursuing. Do you have any advice for them?
Yeah, that's, you might study robins or sunfish. Be careful, yeah. I never knew where my career was going to take me. But seriously, as scientists, I'm going to fall back on something I said much earlier. You need to make sure you get out of your shell. You need to make sure you get out and talk to our stakeholders, make friends with them. There's a lot of good people out there, and just take a little bit of time to get to know them. You'll find all kinds of doors opening, and when you become their friend, their inclination to believe your findings is going to skyrocket. You won't be a stranger anymore. So you need to stay out of the ivory tower. You need to stay out in the field, and you need to work with the people that are actually living and working out in the field, whether they be ranchers, farmers, hunters, bird watchers, all of the above.
I think it might be easy for some to let politics kind of play into the science. How important is it to remain as focused on the science and keep everything else out?
For me personally, it's not difficult. I suspect for other people it may be. I happen to work for an agency that gives me a lot of leeway, and I'm not politically influenced. I've spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C. It's not a fun place to go. There's people there that aren't very nice, but and I've been there under 2 administrations, R's and D's. But truthfully, as a scientist, we cannot allow ourselves. We must remain objective, and we cannot allow ourselves to be anything but objective, or people will not accept our best efforts.
Yeah.
Aaron, can I chime in on
Absolutely.
that? Coming from an industry that's been a target, we've spent a lot of effort to look at the literature, the research, and it's not all created equal. There's good research and there's not so good research. And you really have to dig into it to figure out what's good and what's not good. There's a lot of miscitations. There's a lot of reference to things that are observational, but they come across as being peer-reviewed empirical literature. So one of my suggestions to future scientists is be very careful about the science you're basing your assumptions on, and track it all the way back to the origin and understand what it is that they said at the origin, not what 2 or 3 or 4 people have said in reference to that, because we've seen a lot of that. We've seen it in the sage-grouse work, and we had extensive comments in the DEIS regarding that. And so that's something I really want to pass along, is it's been very educational to me personally to realize how much work you have to go into to find the good science.
Yeah, absolutely, to keep it relevant.
Right.
John,
Could
you
I
had
add
something
something
to add?
too, is that for folks who think that science is complicated, and it is, then you enter human nature. and things get really complicated really quickly, and particularly when you deal with so many different dynamic personalities and interests in a situation like this that is so expansive as sage-grouse. So I think the science is critical, and also you have to try to, if you're going to actually have an effective policy, you also have to work with people at some point, and that was actually what was beneficial about this, is realizing the range of sage-grouse, because they don't recognize ownerships. And so they're on the private property, they're on state lands, they're on federal lands. And so the input of the folks on the private property in keeping those lands intact, whole, and unfragmented is really important if we're going to have sage-grouse continuing to use the public lands. Mm-hmm. And so we really need a combined all lands approach if we're going to have an effective sage-grouse conservation strategy into the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Aaron, if I could maybe concur with a lot of this. The other thing is communicate with those people that are out there, and some of them are going to growl at you. Trust me, there's some crusty old dogs out there. But if you can get their credibility, much of what's been said here is so true. If you're just citing data that's been out there and it's easy to reach and you're putting it in another project, that's where some of this hot button stuff comes, because it may have been taken one line out of a huge paper and that line was pulled out and used 10 years before you guys even get out there to use it. But when you take that and use it again, it perpetuates a supposition or an opinion or something out of context. So be afraid of that, and be fearless about thinking outside the box. And go talk to those people, because as John indicated, many of us run on private, public, and state lands. And so we can get you to some of those places that you might not know are out there, because not everybody gets the opportunity. We're very blessed with being able to be out there and use that resource. But don't stay in your ivory tower, your silo. Talk to people, and talk to all kinds of people, because I'm not going to have every answer. Jack's not going to have every answer. Idaho Power's not going to have every answer. Donna's worked for years on our local sage-grouse working group, and she learns something new at every meeting and shares it with us. So, don't be afraid to get out there. And I think your research projects that you've got your instructors working with you on are really telling you that.
Brent, I'm going to put you on the spot real quick, and that is giving a look ahead. Are you optimistic about where we'll end up eventually when it comes to sage-grouse, and what do you think it's going to look like?
You know what, I've been accused of this often. I am optimistic, because I would like to believe, and especially here in Idaho, that we're going to have the opportunity to do the right thing. And I think part of whether it's this task force or other things that we've pulled together on, is there's a passion here, and we're going to want to move that forward so that we don't unravel everything that's started here. There's a momentum that's working for a really good cause. If we do the right thing for the sage-grouse, it's going to benefit many other things that are out there. So I am optimistic, and I'm not even going to say cautiously optimistic. This is the right thing to do. Now, I am going to say I'm going to be very upset if we don't get the ability to move forward on that, because it is the right thing for the local areas and for Idaho and for what we're doing here.
Donna, you agree?
I agree. The farmers and the ranchers, like Brenda said, they can be very standoffish, and quite frankly, until they get to know you, they're very untrustworthy, because they've been burned so many times on so many issues. But once they get to know what's going on, and once they get to know that they can trust what you're doing and what you're looking for, then they'll give you a lot of knowledge about things that they have seen, anecdotally of course, but that you can work on that anecdotally and go forward and prove what maybe they are saying is true.
Or not.
Or not, yeah, it's true.
Senator, do you have something to add?
Well, my words of advice to all of those aspiring scientists, when you're out in the field, close the gates.
Yeah. Or leave the ones open that were open.
Leave them open, yeah.
Beyond that, though, and it'll be a little more philosophical, your credibility is the single most important thing that you have, and that goes for scientists, it goes for politicians, it goes for anyone that, even in personal life, but anybody that deals with the public. So you build, you know, it's the single most important thing that you have, so value it and build on it. Once you lose it, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to get back. So cherish it and build on it.
I hear a lot of optimism from some of the folks here in this room. What does the 2015 legislative session, what is it going to, is there any kind of movement that we'll see on sage-grouse this coming year?
You know, it remains to be seen, of course. We've, you know, the legislature has, we've endorsed the concurrent resolution endorsing Sage-Grouse Task Force, and that I think was important. We've provided some additional funding to the Office of Species Conservation for monitoring. You know, we'll have to see what some of the needs that are identified, what they might be, and we'll make our case if we come on you know, a pressing need. But as you know, money is scarce, and we have to prioritize. But is this issue all about money? Is it, I mean, I have the sneaking suspicion that really it's going to be a lot of handshaking from folks and buying off and the willingness to compromise. Well, there will certainly be a lot of that. You know, we've got a lot of partners with the federal and the other state agencies, and so we'll constantly be trying to bring all those diverse interests together. All right. Well, we are out of time. Thank you all for being here with us today, and I want to thank those who are watching at home, and that's going to do it for us. Good night.
Funding for this program has been made possible by the Idaho Public Television Endowment, by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and viewers like you. Thank you.